Okay, hello Cloud Gurus and welcome to this lecture. This lecture we're just going to do a recap of what we learnt with Cloud HSM. Now I know it can seem quite complicated. I would recommend doing it once yourself and seeing if you can do it all by yourself from memory, but of course using the commands that we have in the resources section of the course. So what did we do? Well, essentially we went and downloaded the AWS root certificate as well as the manufacturer's root certificate. We then went in and provisioned our cluster and we installed our first hardware security module. When we did that, we were given a bunch of different certificates. So we got the AWS hardware certificate, which authenticates that AWS own the hardware. We got our manufacturer's hardware certificate, which authenticates that the manufacturer actually, went in and built the hardware. We then got our HSM certificate and our cluster's CSR certificate. Our HSM certificate created the certificate when it created the cluster's virtual hardware security module device. So there is a virtual device that sits on the actual hardware security module, but the hardware security module was obviously just dedicated to that device. And this certificate basically asserts that the HSM hardware created the virtual hardware security module. We then also created the cluster CSR, and this cluster CSR is what we needed to get signed by our certificate authority, but we didn't have one, so we used a self-signing certificate. So we then went on to optionally verify our certificate. So we took our AWS root certificate and we created a chain with our AWS hardware certificate. That essentially creates our chain certificate, which we then used with our HSM certificate using OpenSSL, and we verified that that certificate was okay. Likewise, we did the same with our manufacturer's root certificate. We created a chain with our manufacturer's hardware certificate. We then basically took that chain and we used OpenSSL with our HSM certificate, so same certificate as the last one, and then we verified that that was okay as well. There's a lot of certificates, isn't there? So moving it back up, basically, we then took our HSM certificate and our cluster's CSR certificate and we extracted the public keys using OpenSSL, and then we checked that those certificates matched, and they did. And so we were all good to go on to initialize our cluster. In order to initialize our cluster, basically, we had to create a private key using OpenSSL. We then created a self-signed certificate using that private key. We then took that self-signed certificate and used our cluster's CSR as well as our private key using OpenSSL to create our customer HSM certificate. We then took our self-signed certificate and our customer HSM certificate and we used that to initialize our cluster. We then went in and deployed an EC2 instance so that we could go in and manage our cluster. In order to do that, we needed to basically install some software and configure some things. So we needed to download our self-signed certificate to that EC2 instance. We also had to tell that EC2 instance what the private IP address was of our Cloud HSM hardware device. We then basically went in and installed the command line tools, and we used those command line tools to log into our Cloud HSM, first as a pre-crypto officer. We then changed the password and became the primary crypto officer. The pre-crypto officer then disappeared, and then we used the crypto officer to create a crypto user. We then logged in and we basically went in and exported our public and private keys. We then downloaded them to S3 and then onto our PC, and then we went and used the public key on an EC2 instance, and we tested the private key to make sure we could actually go and log into an EC2 instance, and we could. So it's all very complicated, I do admit, but they will ask a hell of a lot of questions around Cloud HSM on the exam, and like anything, the best way to know it is to go in and do it yourself. So do bear that in mind. Plus, it is a really good experience. Like I said, I remember 5 years ago just dying to get access to hardware security modules and to be able to play with them, but they're so expensive that you really couldn't. You had to be working as a network administrator. Solutions architects wouldn't really be touching that stuff because you don't want people controlling your keys. What's really cool now though is that Amazon have released the utility billing model for Cloud HSM. So I probably spent maybe $4 or $5 doing this lab, and I've got really good real world experience. So thank you very much, Amazon. So what are my exam tips? Remember the 4 different types of user types. So we had our pre-crypto officer or preco. That officer went away as soon as we changed our password. Our default admin password was a username and password was admin and password. So we definitely wanted to change that. As soon as we did that, it changed to becoming a crypto officer. We then had our crypto users and our appliance users. The main ones you need to remember, the crypto officers, basically they go in and perform user management operations. So they create users, delete users, change passwords, etc. Crypto users, they have 2 things. They do key management and cryptographic operations. Crypto users create and delete and share and import and export cryptographic keys, which is what we did. And we also use cryptographic keys for encryption, decryption, signing, verifying, and more. And then we have our appliance users, and these are the lowest users, but they are with every single Cloud HSM. It's basically used to synchronize the HSMs in the AWS Cloud HSM cluster, and the AU user exists on all HSMs provided by AWS Cloud HSM and has very limited permissions. So that is it for this lecture, guys. In the next lecture, we're also just going to summarize what we learnt in the VPC section of the course, and you're almost at the end. The next section is going to be quite theoretical. We're just going to talk about compliance and DDoS mitigation and some other things, and then you're all ready to go and sit and take your exams. So if you've got the time, please join me in the next lecture. Thank you.